Hello, I'm Kyle Ballard from the U.S. Department of State's Office to Monitor and Combat Trafficking in Persons. I'm going to present to you some models and findings that explore the trade-offs in identifying human trafficking among migration flows. Please note that the views and findings presented here are those of the author and do not necessarily reflect the views or policies of any U.S. government agency. So what is human trafficking? Human trafficking is the use of force, fraud, or coercion to exploit another individual in the acts of commercial sex or forced labor. There are three elements to a human trafficking crime. There are the acts, which are what is done, such as abduction, recruitment, transportation of, and the means, which are force, fraud, or coercion, such as violence, threats to violence, deception, or debt bondage, and the purpose, why it is done. So, for example, domestic servitude or prostitution. Human trafficking is often considered a hidden crime for two primary reasons. One is that victims are often reluctant to self-identify. So, for example, if you were to be mugged or another crime committed against you, you would have no shame or issue with bringing that crime to the authorities. But victims of human trafficking are often fearful of authorities, because the authorities may be looking at them as criminals rather than victims. The victims may be afraid of their traffickers, or they may have accrued other financial interests or debts in the process of seeking work or being exploited or abused. The other factor is that, as I said, authorities often see criminals rather than victims. So they may be focused more on illegal migration crimes or prostitution as opposed to the conditions or circumstances that brought an individual into those circumstances. These two factors are mutually reinforcing, and again, is why human trafficking is often hidden. So the policies of the state strongly influence whether authorities identify victims and whether victims are willing to self-identify and come forward. Those are the factors that we'll be exploring in these models. Trafficking is particularly prevalent along migration flows because the act of migration or migrating increases an individual's vulnerability to human trafficking. Individuals may be marginalized at home, whether they be a religious minority or discriminated group. The act of transit is often difficult or expensive. And ultimately, they can be more vulnerable in the destination country in places where they don't speak the language, where they don't have social status or economic means to establish themselves in society. These individuals sometimes can be desperate for income, which makes them susceptible to debt bondage or fraud, or they're desperate to escape circumstances at home, such as conflict or discrimination. The authorities who may deny them access to the desired country may inadvertently create circumstances in which potential victims seek dangerous means of entering the country. And again, make them susceptible to debt bondage or putting trust in individuals who look to exploit them. Legal protections of these individuals are ambiguous in the sense that if you're an illegal migrant or, say, for example, engaging in other crimes such as forced drug trafficking or prostitution, you may not have standing with authorities. And mass migration often depletes state resources and ultimately creates a political environment in which migration itself is pushed back against by society and ultimately has a residual impact on how the state seeks or ignores human trafficking as a crime. So take, for example, what is often called the European migration crisis. You'll see that there's a convergence of these normal economic migrants and those fleeing conflict. And those are two distinctions that are largely abstractions but used in these models for the purpose of exploring this topic. You'd see about 1 to 2 million migrants arriving in Europe in 2015. That's increased, and those routes have actually shifted quite a bit over time. But predominantly among that flow, you see several fleeing migrants, such as those fleeing conflict in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria, and others who are seeking economic opportunity that do not exist in places like Kosovo and Albania. Again, individuals from Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria are often also seeking economic opportunity, and individuals from other countries may be fleeing other circumstances. So again, these are two abstractions that are used for simplicity in exploring this topic through modeling. There are two primary approaches to immigration policy by governments. The first being an economic focus, which the government seeks to maximize economic benefit of the country. So governments driven by or shaped by domestic politics take protectionist postures and maximize migrant access to labor markets strategically. And they admit migrants that fill a specific economic need, whether it be a specific skill set or simply to provide labor in the market itself. The other approach is a humanitarian focus, which seeks to provide safe haven to those in need. These approaches tend to focus on specific populations and issues, say, for example, Cuban doctors who seek admittance into the United States, or Syrian religious minorities. And the burden of proof in these schemes are usually lie with the applicant. So, for example, if a Syrian religious minority comes to the United States, try to seek asylum or admissions on a humanitarian basis, they often have to demonstrate that they would be harmed if they were to be returned to their country of origin. Of course, no government has a purely economic or purely humanitarian focus, so immigration policy is largely the balance between these two approaches. And there are two predominant anti-trafficking mindsets. The first considers trafficking as the business or the commodification of migration. And this approach generally assumes that traffickers are profit-maximizing rational actors, and quite frankly that the potential victims are also rational actors. And the enforcement mechanism or actions often taken by governments is done to seek to disrupt financial incentives on the supply side or demand side. So to take actions to tweak the market and disrupt the incentives that leads to human trafficking. And the other mindset is largely the law enforcement trafficking as a crime mindset. And that often assumes a structured criminal network that exploits individuals and moves them across borders and so forth. And the obvious law enforcement action taken in this mindset is to punish those criminal kingpins using kind of traditional law enforcement techniques that focuses on building legal cases and then prosecuting the perpetrators. And a victim-centered approach is the predominant approach advocated by the U.S. government, which basically means that the government should be proactively seeking indicators of human trafficking. They should incentivize self-identification by building trust with victims, building a reputation of trust among victims that propagates through populations, and that does not criminalize or hold accountable victims who are forced into other crimes such as illegal immigration and prostitution. They should provide social services, uphold victims' rights, and ultimately hope that individuals would be more willing to serve as witnesses and evidence against their traffickers so that the perpetrators can be prosecuted. The initial models and findings that we started with, I built with my colleague Brant Horio from LMI Inc., which you can find at this publication here. It was accepted and published after we were accepted for this conference. So that approach had us, we designed a computational model to represent the migration flows. We implemented a cellular automata agent population to build kind of spatial relationships and influence so that the the state's policies and the perceptions of the population impacted the agents and propagated through the population. The migrant agents were linked with a preferential attachment network, and we experimented with several parameters to explore migration policies with and without the victim-centered approach to see what was effective and what was not. The government had either an economic or humanitarian immigration policy, and the agent population was seeded with a predetermined percentage of victims. Those agents were either inclined to cooperate with authorities or deceive those authorities, and those cooperative or deceptive strategies shifted based on the experiences of other agents that were connected along the social network. So it was either based on familial ties and country of origin, but also influenced by those within the neighborhood of each agent. And this generally outlines how those interactions took place. We reached several preliminary conclusions on this model, which I won't go into too much detail. You can read it here, but please do read the publication. The initial question about whether a tipping point exists with respect to initial cooperation levels, the answer is generally yes. We validated that the victim-centered approach within the model generally did improve the detection of human trafficking. But let's focus on the very last one. How does a state's immigration policy impact the willingness of human trafficking victims to self-identify and cooperate, and in turn improve the state's ability to identify human trafficking? If you go to the third bullet in that point, that's the focus on the extended model that I'll present next. What we found in the original model was that more selective immigration policies, which in that case was the economic immigration policy, tended to yield more success in detecting human trafficking. We weren't quite sure. We had lots of theories as to why that might be, but I wanted to validate whether that actually was true in other model instances. So I built a very basic toy model to test this further. But please note that Brant Horio or anyone else was not involved. And again, I extended this a bit after our paper was published so that I could further the research and present something fresh here. But please do not judge anyone else but myself. It's very simple, and the conclusions are still very preliminary. 1,089 agents are distributed across the grid in a cellular automata fashion, similar to the previous model, except that there's no social network undergirding this one, and the agents do not move. The population, again, is seeded with a predetermined percentage of trafficking victims and a predetermined percentage of agents that are inclined to cooperate with authorities. Each agent has 4 attributes. One is labeled an origin or a country of origin, and the others are just X, Y, and Z. The whole idea, even with the country of origin, is that these attributes can be virtually anything, but they should represent things that a government may seek out in terms of its immigration policy. So it could be a skill, it could be a race, a nationality, education level, socioeconomic status, whatever it might be. We didn't really want to impose too many narratives on this model, but just to test to see with different variations of state policies how successful a government will be in identifying trafficking. The user can use the slider and determine how many variations of each attribute exists in the population. The user can use other sliders to determine the contours of the state immigration policy. It can set the quota, i.e. the number of migrants a government might accept from a given model run, but also use these state range sliders to determine how many variants of a given attribute a state might accept. So for example, if you go to the bottom and see the combination of these diversity settings and the state variable, you can say the country of origin, there may be 10 countries of origin among the population, and the government may only accept agents from 5 of those countries. You can do that with all the other different attributes. Again, highly abstract, and you can impose whatever you want those attributes to be. So for the purposes of measuring how permissive or how restrictive a government's immigration policy is, I created a very simple measure called the permissive score, and really it's just a percentage of all possible attribute combinations that the state will allow entry into the country. And you can see policy 1 and policy 2 based off of how many variations of an attribute there are in a population, how many of those variations the government will accept. Simple division gives you a permissive score, the policy on the right being a score of 1, being more permissive, the policy on the left being 0.5, meaning less permissive. So I ran two instances of the model, one with a random activation schedule, the other with a synchronous activation schedule, and I found no difference in terms of the outputs for obvious reasons if you think about that. But in each instance, we ran it 38,400 times, and ultimately you see here the different ranges that we've used to do parameter sweeps. As you'll see with the outputs below, with those several tens of thousands of runs, we found weak correlations between the permissive score of a government's immigration policy and the number of victims is accepted, the number of victims is identified, and ultimately the number of victims that were accepted but were not identified. But the one interesting area I'd say is that the rate at which a government identifies trafficking victims among its accepted migrants was actually negatively correlated with a relatively strong correlation to a state's permissive score. So the original model suggested that a selective immigration policy would yield more success in detecting human trafficking victims, and this very simple toy model seems to validate that finding. So a less permissive policy yields more victims identified. That would then suggest that there are trade-offs in either the resources that a government puts into accepting migrants, accommodating migrants, and accepting and accommodating human trafficking victims, and also that there may be a trade-off between the number of slots a government allows for migration as well as human trafficking victims. It also hints at how domestic politics might play into the success of a government in identifying trafficking victims. So that's to say, when there is domestic political pressure to minimize migration, there may be an adverse impact in terms of overall number of migrants, but it may actually have a positive effect on that same government's ability to identify human trafficking victims. Again, that's a very, very preliminary and potentially controversial finding, and it's not one that I would put too much stock in without further research, but I tend to carry that research on in the future. And there's very good reason to be skeptical of these initial findings. The model itself is very abstract. Obviously, human trafficking, immigration, and policies that relate to both of those things are much more complex than portrayed in these models and even in my narration of these models. The agent population in this model is static. It's both physically stationary and unaffected. Each agent's unaffected by other agents, which obviously is not how the real world works, and it's a significant abstraction and oversimplification from even our own previous model. But again, this was a toy model to test the logic and see if it was supported. This current model assumes that state quotas for migrants is directly limiting of those of trafficking victims. So by definition, I've created a dynamic that's zero sum. And of course, policies are much more nuanced, as I stated before. States may have distinct trafficking-related policies that are completely separate, distinct, maybe complementary, but maybe completely distinct from their migration policies, and they may actually have dedicated resources, dedicated law enforcement units, dedicated trainings and so forth for border protection officers, and you may even have separate quotas for human trafficking. So that abstraction is quite significant. And unlike in real life, the modeled government here identifies victims if the quota has not been met and the victim has a cooperative strategy. Of course, that assumes that the government is capable and willing to identify victims, which of course in the real world is not often the case. This model does not require the government to take any efforts to create favorable conditions, unlike in the previous model and unlike in real life. So that is to say that if these simple conditions are met, then the victim is automatically identified, and we know from experience in real life that that's just simply not the case in the real world. Again, this is a heavily abstracted model, and ultimately I am very hesitant to put any stock into the conclusions at this point, but I do hope you found it interesting, and I do look forward to hearing your comments on its implementation and how it can be extended or useful, or quite frankly, how you think it might be garbage. So I appreciate your time. Thank you very much.